Now, I said yesterday the Prime Minister had found his mojo. Well, he put defiant premiers on notice, a December deadline to remove coronavirus restrictions. Well done, Prime Minister. He told the federal parliament, and I quote, "The restrictions and the arrangements we have today are not things we want to see by Christmas," unquote. And he's targeting borders as an economic issue. And Anthony Albanese, Albo, you're a mile off the mark when you ask the Prime Minister, quote, "Why is the Prime Minister spending time fighting state premiers instead of fixing an economy that's in crisis?" 0 out of 10, Albo. That is how you start to fix the economy. Sort out these power-hungry premiers. Just on that, Annastacia Palaszczuk, indeed no leader, should imagine the creation of some hotline to streamline medical exceptions for New South Wales patients is going to get any government off the hook, let alone to say it's going to happen by the end of this week. How much trauma and tragedy has been created in the intervening period by this ruthless, callous, stubborn, indifferent, uncaring, unsympathetic and irresponsible denial of parents and children access to one another, especially when there's international evidence which says, including from the World Health Organization, that border closures should not be an answer to what's called a pandemic, which of course is not a pandemic. The Byron Bay Shire Mayor is saying that hundreds of thousands of people have been denied medical and employment services since the Queensland-New South Wales border was closed through, quote, no fault of their own. Scott Morrison said from the outset, the borders should not be closed. These premiers are in open defiance of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is right when he said last week, and I quote, any Australian, wherever they are, who needs medical treatment should be able to access it, particularly in an emergency, in any Australian hospital in whatever state they are in, unquote. I spoke yesterday to the mother who couldn't access her children at boarding school. As if these kids haven't gone through enough. Dozens of parents from rural New South Wales telling story after story of anxiety and heartache about being separated from their children. Does Annastacia Palaszczuk care? Obviously not. She keeps prospering the lie that she's protecting Queenslanders. Annastacia, I say it again, that is a lie. You cannot provide any scientific proof that border closures save a single life. But I'll tell you what you can demonstrate, that the isolation of children from their families is creating an extraordinary mental health crisis. You're not saving lives, Annastacia, you're threatening them. You are piling pressure on kids who deserve better. Obviously, the death of an unborn baby girl from Ballina last week has made not one iota of difference. There'll be a hotline by the end of the week, and you can imagine what the hotline will be like. Well, what are we doing to farmers who can't do business because they can't cross the border? What are we doing to kids sitting in the HSC, facing extraordinary trauma of being unable to have access to their families? None of these parents who are suffering, none of the families of the sick who are suffering can afford to test their constitutional entitlements before a court. They can't afford it. It's even worse when you prosper the lie, oh, we're doing all this to save lives. I repeat, there's not one scintilla of evidence that can demonstrate that closing a border saves any lives. But, of course, we're not really closing the border, are we? Oh, no, no, no. Now, if you're a rugby league coach or a boxing ring worker or a diplomatic security guard or a yacht owner or a TV celebrity or the son of a trucking billionaire, the border is wide open. Sad, isn't it, that it depends on who you are. Henry Ergas is a distinguished Australian, an economist who's worked at the OECD. He's worked for a number of economic consulting firms. He's vaultingly bright. And he cited Article 13 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, reaffirmed in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The principle that, and I quote, everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country, unquote. And yet here we have not only state borders closed, but international borders. Australians can't go to another state and they can't leave their own country. It is almost laughable. As Henry Ergas says, quote, what is unacceptable is the absence of any careful, publicly available justification for the restrictions and the manner in which they operate. Henry Ergas argues that during the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it was the Australian delegation which argued, and I quote, the freedom of movement is unquestionably one of the fundamental rights of man. What have we got? No rights, no explanations, no justification. Governments relying on coercion and force. We've become a police state. They're at the borders. They're outside your home. In Victoria, they've got the power to enter your home without your permission. Now, Prime Minister Morrison does have a very powerful sanction. If the states want federal assistance, they should submit what they're doing to regulatory review. As Henry Ergas rightly says, quote, "The virus has shattered enough lives, with no end in sight, to the draconian powers governments have claimed for themselves. It would turn tragedy into disaster if we allowed it to destroy our freedoms as well." Well, I'm saying tonight to premiers, if you're not prepared to allow people to cross the border to earn a living and indeed put food on our table, that's farmers, if you're not going to allow parents to cross the border to see their kids when they're sitting for the HSC, if you're not going to allow people to cross the border without filling in 1,000 forms to consult the doctor of their choice, then you must understand one thing. The electorate and commentators like me will not forget when election time comes around.